there any shame involved with that too?
Absolutely, right? I grew up, and I think all of us have grown up with that narrative that to drink too much, to be an alcoholic, is to be like bottom of society, an undesirable person. You associate it with like a moral flaw, right? For me, culturally, I'm first generation American. Like, my family in Spanish would have all these terms like borracho, vago, like lazy, drunk, for anybody in the family who struggled with alcohol, there were all the dirtiest terms in the book that I saw my family call those folks. And so I knew I didn't want to be associated with that. So I knew in my mind, I had internalized that as a bad thing because of the language that my family used and also the way society frames people with alcoholism and alcohol use disorder. So the idea of even being labeled as something like that was paralyzing and terrifying, especially as a teacher, because here I am supposed to be
Hmm.
model
Hmm.
citizen working with people's children, but I sure loved
Mhm.
alcohol, right? So there was absolutely shame in all of that for sure, like fueling the secrecy behind my decisions and the calculations behind making sure that I never drank more than anyone
Do you think
else.
that beyond the happy hours that you went to with your coworkers, do you think that there was maybe something underlying about teaching that was making you want to seek the alcohol or seek that release?
Yeah, I mean, teaching was always over the years that I was a public school teacher,
Hmm.
so 13 years. I definitely saw standards get increasingly
You
difficult
taught in New
to
York. You
reach,
Yes.
taught in New
or
York City.
teachers getting
You taught in New
help.
York City. Okay, so did
Yeah,
I.
I taught
Okay,
in New York City
okay,
for 4 years, and then I taught in
okay.
Kentucky for 8. And so in both those states that I taught in, what I saw was the transition to my performance being tied to how my students were performing. But my students also had learning disabilities, right? And they're getting held to the exact same academic performance and standards as their peers
Mhm.
without disabilities. And, like, yes, you can make arguments for, well, with the implementation of an individualized education plan, and they get these accommodations, and they get a reader, and they get a calculator, they should be able to perform commensurate with their peers. But the fact of the matter is that students with disabilities, students of color, poor students, like students in all these different populations, are experiencing a wild gap in their learning and in
Absolutely.
their learning outcomes. But then the teachers are being held accountable. And so, as an educator, if you don't have good coping skills to manage that pressure, absolutely you're going to want to go escape after work when you feel like a failure day after day, when you see those scores coming back and you're feeling like your job is on the line. I mean, like, literally there were times that, depending on the cycle of the year, who was the superintendent at that time, my teacher evaluation, my students test scores were tied to my evaluation as a teacher, right? And again, I was a middle school teacher, so my students were already coming to me with years of baggage, years of being in systems
Hmm.
that are struggling to
Hmm.
teach them effectively. And I'm still being held accountable for the gap that started when they were probably like 3 years old and
Correct.
were like in preschool. So, absolutely, I think teaching really sets you up to
I
struggle
agree.
for
I
sure.
taught in New York City for 18 and a half years in the urban area in Queens.
Oh,
And it was the most diverse school. There were 64 different, 64 different nationalities represented, probably about 57 languages. It was an incredible place, but it was a Title I school. And I used to co-teach mostly. So what that means is, if people don't know, is there were usually about 12 um, special education students in the room, and then another, let's say 20 general education students in the room, two teachers. And the learning gap between the general education students and the special education students was not that wide. And it's exactly what you were saying, because a lot of the students already came in disadvantaged because of the home life where they came from, whatever it might be. And I think a lot of that, like you're saying, translates right to the teachers, especially with the accountability, but also too, as a teacher, you understand these students, you see them every day, and you take on a lot of their baggage. So my experience at the school that I worked in was most people were either alcoholics or really very heavy marijuana users. It was either one of the two. And those are usually what most teachers were. And I'm going to admit, I was a very heavy marijuana user. It became one of the things that, for me, when I got home at night, if I didn't do it, I couldn't go to work the next day. It was the only way for me to actually function, to get through that evening into the next day. So I actually relate to you, and I do understand this. And
Yeah.
I feel that a lot of people relate to your story. And I'm curious to hear a little more about that. I'm curious to hear about, your experiences, I guess, dealing with it and getting yourself to feel